Dear people watching and listening, Assalamu alaikum. Kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please support my channel by contributing to my Patreon account so that I can continue making the audiobook series. The part 2 of the book continues with the detailed narration of the Muslim conquest of North Africa, which is also known as the Muslim conquest of the Maghrib. The conquest was led initially by amrbinalaas and then continued on with uqbabinnafe. The conquest of North Africa lasted from 647 AD to 709 AD. Start of Chapter 15. The Battle of Subetula. The Muslims set off in the direction of Africa. They passed by another famous landmark of the Second World War, Benghazi, and marched along the Mediterranean coast and going round the Bay of Sirte. The column arrived at Tripoli. It was now about the middle of March, Tamadiul Akhir. Tripoli was very much part of the Roman kingdom of Gregory, and no doubt was left in the minds of the Muslims that if they wanted Tripoli they would have to fight for it. The Muslims wanted Tripoli and laid siege to it. This was a repetition of the operations of 22 Hijri, when amrbinalaas had come and invested the city. He had found no way in, and because the city could be supplied by sea, he had settled down in a long siege. It was only the chance discovery of neglect on the part of the defenders and an opening near the beach which led to a few bold Muslim warriors rushing into the city, which in turn led quickly to its fall. This time again the Muslims laid siege and settled down along the landward side of the fortified city. It appears that the Romans had not learned the right lesson from their experience of 5 years ago, because the opening to the beach from the side of the city was still there. Consequently, the Muslims positioned strike groups on either side of the city near the coast to watch for ships bringing supplies and reinforcements to the city. Somehow their dispositions made the harbor of Tripoli unusable, and fleets coming to the city were not able to use it. Movement of personnel and supplies to Tripoli from the sea had to be carried out across the beaches. King Gregory of Africa sat in his palace at Subetula, where he had established his capital. When exactly and why he moved to Subetula is not known. Perhaps he feared counteraction from Constantinople, against which he had rebelled, and Carthage was more vulnerable to a seaborne expedition than Subetula, which was 150 miles south of Carthage and 100 miles from the sea to the east. In this palace he received intelligence of the arrival of the Muslims at Tripoli, and their laying siege to the city. He was taken aback by this unexpected news. His reaction was immediate. The kingdom was threatened, and he would have to act fast to defend it against this new danger from the desert. It would take time to get an army together for a major battle against an invading force of 20,000 men, and the Muslim advance had to be delayed until his preparations were complete. In order to keep the Muslims occupied in their siege and make sure that Tripoli did not fall, he sent a reinforcement group by sea to the beleaguered city. The ships arrived at Tripoli to find that they could not get into the harbor, at least not safely. They had to discharge troops in the water near the beach from where the Romans had to wade ashore with their weapons and equipment. The strength of this reinforcement is not known, but apparently it was manageable from the Muslim point of view. As they arrived on the beach, the Muslim strike force from both sides of the city charged into them. Caught in a vulnerable state, disorganized and tired, attacked from two sides by fresh troops, the Romans were cut to pieces on the beach. The siege went on. The Muslims had no siege equipment, catapults with which to pound the city or testudos under the protection of which to batter the gates of the fort. They remained vigilant and made sure that no reinforcements or supplies got to the city from the sea. Abdullah bin Saad also sent scouts in the direction of Subetula to keep an eye on the movement of forces from the west. Knowing that the relief of Tripoli had failed, and that it could fail any day because of lack of supplies, Gregory hastened his military preparations. Soon his army was ready for battle. It was a very large army, 120,000 strong according to historians, even Gibbon, but this figure is obviously a gross exaggeration. Such a vast army was not possible in the province of Africa, nor was there time to put it together, nor would it be possible to maneuver such a force tactically in battle. The actual strength of the Roman army may have been about half, that is 60,000 men, and we will work on this estimate in our account of the battle, acknowledging the possibility of error. Meanwhile, Abdullah bin Saad was getting tired of sitting at Tripoli and watching a garrison which showed no sign of giving in. For all he knew, this stalemate could go on for months, wasting precious time, while a few marches away lay the richest part of Africa, offering immense wealth to the invader. There would be Roman legions guarding that wealth, but they would have to fight in the open, which the Arabs preferred to siege warfare. Consequently, Abdullah raised the siege and marched to the west. The garrison and the inhabitants of Tripoli were relieved to see the last of the desert warriors. They were, however, in no position to cause any kind of nuisance to the Muslim army by their position in the rear of the Muslims and on the Muslim line of communication. In the first place, they lacked the strength and the will to engage two Muslims. In the second place, as explained in the preceding chapter, the Muslims did not depend on supply lines and had no line of supply with which anyone could interfere. So the Muslims marched on, without any fear for their rear. After a journey of several days, the army passed through Gabes and made for Subetula. It was about now that King Gregory came to know about the advance of the Muslims. Putting all his forces together, he marched from Subetula with the intention of opposing the Muslim advance well forward of his capital. His move was inevitably slow, because such a large and heavily equipped army, with only one road for movement, could not move very fast. The Romans arrived at Faz, 30 miles from Subetula, and went into camp. Gregory also placed a part of his army forward as a protective force to cover his preparations for the main battle, which he intended to fight here. Hardly had the Romans gone into camp when the Muslim advance guard and all cavalry force appeared on the scene and without delay attacked the Roman covering force. After a short, sharp encounter, the latter was driven back to the main Roman camp. This was an inauspicious beginning for the Romans, and did nothing to restore the confidence of King Gregory, who appears to have been no great battlefield commander. He at once gave orders for his army to fall back on Subetula. The Roman withdrawal from Faz was not molested by the Muslim cavalry, and a few miles short of Subetula, the Romans turned and went into battle positions facing east. This was a better place for the Romans to fight a major tactical action. Being closer to their base gave them solid logistical advantages, and from this position they could give direct protection to the capital. While at Faz they could have been outmaneuvered. The more mobile Muslim army could outflank the Roman main body and get to Subetula without engaging in a set-piece battle. The Roman strength lay mainly in infantry. They were not very strong in cavalry. Soon after the Romans had completed their retrograde movement, the Muslims arrived upon the scene and went into camp a short distance from the Roman front. As per Muslim custom, Abdullah bin Saad sent envoys to Gregory, inviting him to embrace Islam, failing which, if he preferred to avoid bloodshed, he could pay the jizya and come under Muslim rule. The invitation and the alternative were rejected with indignation by the king, and the Muslim envoys returned to inform their commander and their comrades of the Roman answer to their offer. The issue would have to be decided on the field of battle. The space between the two camps, which was to become the battlefield, was about 4 miles from Subetula. The ground had a slight eastward slope, but it was so gradual as to be hardly perceptible, and was certainly of no tactical importance. The battlefield was, for all purposes, level, though bordered on its northern side by a low ridge, about 100 feet in height. This ridge ran east-west, 3 miles north of the main road, comprising at places a single long feature, at others a broken line of separate small bits of high ground. At its western end, it curved into and entered the walled area of Subetula, giving the town's northern edge an elevated position. In other words, the northern wall of the town was built over the ridge. For the purpose of this narrative, we will call this ridge North Ridge. Between North Ridge and the road was a small round hillock, 50 feet high, a little less than a mile from the road, which we will call Olive Hill, because there is a prominent olive tree growing right on top of it. And on the other side of the road there was another ridge, South Ridge, 50 to 100 feet in height, but mainly in the Muslim area. Olive Hill gave excellent observation of the battlefield, as did the western end of South Ridge, and it was a stroke of luck for the Muslims to be in possession of these features. The two armies formed up for battle, the Romans to the west, the Muslims to the east. The Roman front was 6 miles wide, lying astride the road, with their left on North Ridge. It was just over 3 miles forward of Subetula. The Romans adopted a sound disposition which enabled them to effectively cover their city. They made the mistake of not including Olive Hill in their position, but perhaps they were reluctant to let the ground draw them away from Subetula. Facing them, the Muslims also deployed on a 6-mile front with their right on North Ridge, and their front a bit ahead of Olive Hill and South Ridge. They had possession of these two hill features, but otherwise the merits of ground were equal for the two armies, and the flat, level plain was suitable for the action of infantry and cavalry. We do not know accurately the proportion of cavalry to infantry in the Muslim army, or how the cavalry was disposed, but they appear to have been strong in cavalry, and their light, fast-moving horse regiments gave them greater mobility and flexibility. Both sides were full of fight, full of an eager anticipation of victory, full of a grim determination to win. Both knew that upon the outcome of this contest depended the fate of Africa. Either the kingdom of Gregory would survive and prosper, or the Muslims would gain another large province and the people of Africa would merge into the rising empire of Islam. If the Muslims lost the battle, it would be another generation, certainly another decade before they could venture again into the West with warlike intentions. The Roman army was the more imposing of the two, exulting in its numbers, its equipment, and its well-tried system of war. We call it the Roman army because until only a year before, it had formed part of the Eastern Roman Empire. The army had Romans and Greeks. It had Vandals, a blond Germanic people who had ruled Africa a little more than a century before. It had Numidians. Numidia was the province to the west of Subetula, who were Berbers and Negroes and sometimes a mixture of the two. And there were the true desert Berbers, dashing horsemen, individually brave but collectively more suitable for light operations and raids than a set-piece battle. The Roman army was magnificent to behold. Against this, the Muslims seemed few, only a third in number and less imposing in appearance, but in courage they were far ahead of their adversaries, and in faith they were above all mankind. the presence in their ranks of fine officers and noble Muslims, companions of their beloved Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, further strengthened their confidence in themselves and their conviction of God's help in battle. They would win or die, they would return victorious or not return at all. The Romans and the Muslims were in high spirits, not because of their commanding generals, but in spite of them. Abdullah bin Saad was overawed by the numbers and splendid organization of Gregory's army. His men had little faith in him, and he knew it. He may have thought ruefully how much easier it was to extract taxes from a subject people than to command an army in battle against a powerful opponent. His men thought he was soft, and he was. Having given orders for battle and seen to the forming up and arraying of units and tribal contingents, Abdullah positioned himself at a suitable place behind the army, where there was no danger to his person. Gregory was not in high spirits either, mainly because destiny had at last brought him face to face with the Muslims. For the last quarter century, the Muslims had faced enemies in battle, first Arabs, then Romans and Persians, then Egyptians and Berbers, and everyone had fallen before their onslaught. Gregory was not in high spirits either, mainly because destiny had at last brought him face to face with the Muslims. For the last quarter century, the Muslims had faced enemies in battle, first Arabs, then Romans and Persians, then Egyptians and Berbers, and everyone had fallen before their onslaught. Now they were here, with Gregory and his new kingdom as their objective, and there was something about the Muslim cavalry which dismayed the king. There was a lot of it. Horsemen mounted on spirited, prancing Arabian horses, which were smaller but faster than his heavy chargers. The sight of the hard faces of the lean, tanned, battle-scarred veterans who rode these horses did not help Roman spirits. Gregory would fight this battle not because he wanted to, but because he had to. He had a large throne-like seat prepared for himself at the northern edge of the town, within the city wall, on the high ground which marked the end of the North Ridge. This place gave him good observation over the battlefield and became his command post. His staff and advisers were present here, and a number of horses were kept ready for him and his officers. When he sat upon his throne, 2 maids shaded him from the hot summer sun with peacock feathers. Behind him a large platform was erected, upon which others stood to watch the battle, including his daughter and her maids. The princess will appear shortly in our narrative. It was the midsummer of 648, last quarter of 27 Hijri. One fine summer morning the battle began. We know nothing about the details of the first part of this battle, except that there was a lot of fierce fighting, that at dawn the 2 armies would form up and the fighting would start, that it would go on uninterrupted until midday, when tired and hot, the soldiers would disengage and return to their respective camps for food and rest. The next day this process would be repeated, and so it went on for several days. There was no break in the fighting. Neither side could gain an advantage. There were no brilliant maneuvers, just hard, merciless slogging in a frontal clash of arms. Neither side would give in, each hoping that the next day would be better. The 2 army commanders made no attempt to influence battle by their presence at the front, but preferred the safety of their headquarters in the rear, from where they watched the fighting and waited for God's help. Then, when several days had passed like this, Gregory got the idea that he would gain an advantage over the invaders of his realm if he could get their commander killed. This would not be an easy thing to do, and anyone attempting the task would face great personal danger. So he decided to offer his daughter to the champion who carried out the deed. The daughter of Gregory was a beautiful maid, as lovely as she was intelligent and brave. From childhood she had been trained in the art of riding, and the use of the bow and the sword, and apparently in this very battle she had been conspicuous not only for her beauty and rich adornment, but also her presence in the front line. Whether she did more damage to the bodies of the Muslims than to the hearts of the Romans, we do not know. Her name was Sabiya. Gregory sent for her. She came and stood on the platform behind him, accompanied by 40 maids. She was wearing her weapons as well as her fine clothes and jewelry. The king then announced, "By the Messiah and the Christian faith, if any man will kill the commander of the Arabs, Abdullah bin Saad, I shall wed my daughter to him, and give him all that she has, her maids and her wealth, and he will have a position near me which none else can hope for." As an afterthought, he threw in 100,000 pieces of gold. The offer of the king was soon passed on to everybody in the army, and the young soldiers, whether Roman or Greek or African, were excited by the prospects of winning not only a lady of incomparable beauty, but also wealth and honor. The king's offer had an excellent effect on the spirits of his army, and everyone dreamed of himself being the lucky winner. The news of this offer also spread in the Muslim army, and the courage of Abdullah bin Saad, never very high, suffered a further decline. He did not relish the idea of being a target of special efforts by the Romans. He countered Gregory's offer by announcing, "By the Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, on whom be the blessings of Allah, whoever kills Gregory, I shall give him his daughter and all that she has." This was a good one, because it would cost him nothing. In fact, this amounted to making Gregory pay for his own death. Having made this announcement, Abdullah bin Saad drew from his command post, and as an extra precaution, went to his tent in the Muslim camp to think. This did not have a good effect on the Muslim soldiers, who were accustomed to seeing their generals with them in the front rank, and looked with contempt upon one who put his own safety above the well-being of his soldiers. But their courage remained high in spite of the absence of their commander. The two announcements led to harder fighting for the next few days, but the pattern remained the same. At dawn, the armies would form up and go for each other's throats. There would be a healthy give and take. Men would be killed and wounded, and by noon, suffering from fatigue and the heat of the day, the two sides would break contact and retire to the shelter of their camps. The bloody deadlock continued. Then one morning Abdullah bin Zubair, who was fighting in the right wing of the Muslim army, was approached by a Berber chieftain who was an officer in Gregory's army. He had things to tell the Muslims. Abdullah was the son of Zubair, our hero of the Egyptian campaign. Zubair had been a hero of many campaigns before that, and as a cousin of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and one of the special 10 companions, he had a high position indeed. Abdullah was born 20 months after the Prophet migrated to Medina, and had the distinction of being the first Muslim baby to be born in Medina. Now 25 years of age, he was a young man and a skillful fighter, having inherited most of the enviable qualities of his father. He was very well born, being not only a nephew of the Prophet but also a grandson of Caliph Abu Bakr, whose daughter Asma was Abdullah's mother, and everyone thought he looked just like Abu Bakr. Abdullah would one day become Caliph at Mecca and rule over much of Arabia for 12 years, in defiance of the Umayyad Caliphs at Damascus. Finally, he would fall in battle, sword in hand, defending Mecca against the villainous Hajjaj bin Yusuf, who actually besieged and attacked the holy city and later crucified the body of Abdullah. But that is outside the scope of this history. For the present, Abdullah bin Zubair was here, in the right wing of the Muslim army, fighting the enemies of Allah in the battle of Subetula, and at this point in our narrative, talking with the Berber chieftain. The Berber had had enough of fighting and lost hope of a Roman victory. Wishing to end the battle and at the same time win the favor of the Muslims, he had stealthily crossed the lines to contact the Muslims and was now showing Abdullah bin Zubair how a Muslim victory could be hastened. He told Abdullah about the position of King Gregory, his command post, the fact that there were very few guards present with him, his nearness to the northern gate of Subetula, which was open and unguarded. Since the battle had consisted over so many days of fierce frontal clashes, there had been no threat to the northern gate, and its security had consequently been neglected. If a Muslim group could carry out a cautious, unseen approach and then dash through the gate, it would get Gregory without anyone intercepting it. The Berber seemed sincere in what he said. Furthermore, he indicated the route which the Muslims should take, a route which lay behind North Ridge, and how to approach the gate through which they would reach the king. In fact, he offered to act as guide and lead the Muslims to the gate. As a result of this episode and the action of the Berber against his own commander, the northern gate would become known as Babul Ghadar, the gate of treachery. Within minutes a plan emerged in Abdullah's mind. He moved back from the Muslim right wing and rode to the camp to see the commanding general, who was still in his tent. He went to the tent but was stopped by a guard who stood in front of it. Abdullah asked the guard to be allowed to go in. "Let him be," said the guard, referring to his general. "He is thinking about your problem. When he has a decision to give, he will send for the people." "I have to discuss something with him," said Abdullah. "He has ordered me to keep people away from him until he calls me." Disappointed at not being able to put his ideas before the army commander, Abdullah bin Zubair began to walk away. His route took him past the rear of the tent. The rear flap was open so that Abdullah bin Saad was able to see him. He called to him, "Come here." Abdullah bin Zubair entered the tent from the rear. The commander-in-chief was reclining on a couch. "What brings you here, O son of Zubair?" he asked. "I have seen a weakness on the enemy's part," Abdullah bin Zubair explained. "I hope it is an opportunity Allah has given us, and I fear that it may be lost." He then described the situation as he saw it, the exposed position of King Gregory and how vulnerable he was. Abdullah bin Zubair had certain ideas about how to exploit the Roman weakness, what forces would be needed, how to time the operation to get the full benefit of surprise, and not only knock out the enemy commander, but also create a shock effect on his army which would facilitate its subsequent destruction. For Abdullah bin Saad, this was a gift from heaven. Here was a man telling him how to win the battle with a quick, neat maneuver like a surgical operation, and he was prepared to do it all himself, which meant that the army commander would not have to expose his person to danger in order to achieve victory. He came out of his tent. There were several officers present there, connected with units of the reserve cavalry. They were neither liaison officers who could carry his orders or the commanders of reserve units. "We do not know the strength of the reserve, but we do know that there were several units. Its strength may have been a few thousand." Abdullah bin Saad put the entire reserve under Abdullah bin Zubair and told them to do what he did and go where he went. For the rest of the day, Abdullah bin Zubair gave his plans and orders, and the orders were passed on to all concerned. Preparations were made for the next day's crucial action. There was an explosion of enthusiasm, especially among the cavalrymen selected for the special stroke to be launched by Abdullah bin Zubair. Dismayed and disheartened over the past many days by the inaction and lack of spirit of Abdullah bin Saad, who was their commander only because he was the Caliph's foster brother, the men thought that they had at last found a new leader, a hero who would break the impasse and lead them to victory. What is more, he was a nephew of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and a grandson of Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala anhu. Abdullah bin Zubair was mobbed by soldiers. They knew that he was going to do something very gallant and very risky, and they wanted to share with him the honor and the thrill, so they crowded around him. Abdullah picked 30 men from the large number of volunteers. These stalwarts would go in with him. He told them what he was going to do and what their job would be. "I am attacking," said Abdullah bin Zubair. "Defend me against those who attack me from the rear, and I shall defend you from the front, inshallah." During the night that followed, troops of cavalry were positioned behind the right edge of the Muslim front, covered by the low hills which marked the end of North Ridge. By the morning, everything was ready. Every unit and group was in position. Everyone knew what he had to do. Even the main body of the army would go through the morning's pitiless work as if nothing else was going to happen. Bubbling with excitement, impatient for action, praying for victory, the army awaited the coming of the hour. Noon came, and the two armies, locked in combat since early morning, broke contact and separated. They began to pull back towards their respective camp, hardly looking at each other. If the Muslim movement was a bit slower than normal and apparently more reluctant, it was not noticed by the Romans. They just could not get back fast enough. The soldiers headed for their tents, taking off their armor as they went, fainting with fatigue and heat, drawing comfort from the thought that there would be no fighting till the next day. The king watched this engagement and the mutual retirement to camp. He would stay at this viewpoint a bit longer, watching the battlefield cleared of its dead and wounded, and the fallen weapons and equipment collected. Perhaps at this time he would make some adjustments for the next day's action. A large staff stood at a respectful distance, awaiting their master's orders. A few men of the royal bodyguard stood idly to his left, by the Gate of Treachery. Had they known that the gate would be so named because of the blow that was about to befall them, they would have been more watchful. Gregory did not see the small, dark mass emerge from behind North Ridge and make for the gate. The pattern of the last many days' fighting had been so fixed that nothing unusual had happened, and the king was not looking for anything unusual, nor noticed it. And the delayed presence of the Muslim army on the battlefield helped to divert the king's attention from the rapidly moving group of 30 horsemen, led by a bold rider who kept a few lengths ahead of his men. A much larger strength of cavalry was also on the move behind the cover of North Ridge, but would not be seen until a little later. The troop of horse raced at a fast gallop through the gate. The king still did not see him, but the few guards standing between the king and the gate quickly formed a line to face the Arab horse. The troop got nearer, with its leader away ahead of his men. As he approached the line of the bodyguard, the officer lowered his lance and charged. He broke the line and was in. He saw King Gregory mounted on a grey horse with his staff standing some distance beyond him. On one side stood the princess with her maids, and two of the girls stood nearby with peacock feathers in their hands. It was only now that Gregory turned and saw the Arab officer, but he was still not able to comprehend the meaning of this intrusion. What happened next is best described in the words of Abdullah bin Zubair himself. There was an open ground between him and me. He thought I was an envoy to him until he saw the condition of my weapons. Then he thought that I was running away to him. When I got to him, I struck him with my lance. He fell, and I threw myself upon him. As Abdullah drew his dagger to cut off the Roman's head, the two girls who stood nearby flung themselves upon him in an attempt to protect their sovereign, with the result that the first blow of Abdullah's dagger severed the hand of one of the girls. He managed to push them away. Again, using his dagger, he cut off the head of King Gregory, and fixing it on the point of his lance, raised it high in the air for all to see. In a few moments, the officers of Gregory's staff were upon the Muslim warrior, and Abdullah was hard put to defend himself. But the danger passed as soon as it had arisen, because the 30 stalwarts arrived on the scene and made short work of the Roman officers. The fighting at the Roman command post had hardly begun when it was over. Soon the alarm was raised in the Roman army. Some knew what had happened, others knew that something terrible must have happened. And since this happened while the Romans were wearily making for their tents with their horse unbridled and their armor doffed, the result caused much confusion. And as if Allah Himself had chosen the perfect moment, the Muslim reserve cavalry, organized as a single striking force, broke cover from the north, from behind North Ridge where it had lain in wait. Formed in extended assault order, it plunged into the flank of the Roman army. The striking force swept across the battlefield, playing havoc with lance and saber. At the same time, the main body of the Muslim army turned about and rushed back frontally into the battlefield. The Romans never regained their balance. The cavalry slew large numbers of helpless Roman soldiers who, without order and without organization, turned into a rabble. The last action did not take very long. The battlefield turned into a slaughterhouse as panic-stricken Romans fled in all directions to escape the horror. Broken bodies of Romans and Greeks, Numidians and Berbers were strewn on the plain as a grim reminder of the terrible outcome of the last phase of the Battle of Subetula. A large number of imperial soldiers, several thousand in strength, survived the converging Muslim attack and made for the city of Subetula, a little to the rear, but they never got into the city. Their flight had not ended when a large part of the striking force, having done a fine job on the battlefield, traveled at a fast pace around the flank of the retreating Romans and joined Abdullah bin Zubair at the northeastern edge of the town. Abdullah sent off the squadrons without delay to take up actions covering the gates of Subetula and prevent entry and exit. Thus, as the fugitives arrived at the gates of Subetula, in the hope of finding refuge within its walls from their pursuers, they were charged in front by the Muslim cavalry. Again there was much slaughter, and again the Romans broke and fled in all directions. By the time darkness fell, the battlefield and the city of Subetula were in Muslim hands. The Roman army of King Gregory had been cut to pieces. The city of Subetula was taken as a prize of war and pillaged by the conquerors. On the following day, mounted groups were set in pursuit of Roman survivors of the battle. These fugitives were pursued in all directions over plains and hills, and while some were killed, a large number were captured and brought in. Many Roman officers fought to the last, preferring death to dishonor, but most of the fugitives surrendered without resistance. Abdullah bin Zubair recalled seeing, just in one spot, more than 1,000 prisoners. One column went to Ch15, a town 50 miles to the south, and sacked it, collecting a great number of slaves and a great amount of wealth. Those of the Romans who survived the battle and the pursuit took refuge in forts well away from Subetula. Abdullah bin Saad wasted no time in taking charge of affairs. He established his headquarters at a place where the city of Caravan would later be built, and organized the raiding and collection of plunder. The Muslims were astonished at the vast amount of wealth which came in as booty, mainly gold and silver, but they also accumulated large herds of cattle and flocks of sheep, which would feed the army for several months. As soon as this phase was over, Abdullah bin Saad marched the Muslim army to Carthage and laid siege to the ancient city. After what had happened to the army of King Gregory, the inhabitants of the city were in no mood for battle or even the rigors of a siege, and not many days had passed before they asked for terms. Talks were held. The local leaders offered to pay the Muslim state 300 kantara of gold annually as jizya if the Muslims would go away and not come back again. To this, unbelievably, Abdullah bin Saad agreed. The terms of the treaty were drawn up accordingly and signed. The Muslims would keep whatever they had acquired in the campaign so far, that is, the plunder and the slaves, and would receive every year 300 kantara of gold, in return for which they would go away from Africa. 300 kantara came to 2,520,000 gold dinars. This payment was meant for the state and would go to Medina as jizya. Of the rest of the booty acquired in battle and pursuit, 4/5 were distributed among the soldiers. The horseman got 3,000 dinars and the foot soldier 1,000, one of the highest payments ever made in the short history of Islam to victorious soldiers. Then there was the girl, a beautiful princess offered by both sides to whoever would kill the opposing commander-in-chief. Gregory had been killed by Abdullah bin Zubair, and the poor thing had seen the bloody act. But Abdullah had said nothing about it, and made no claim for his fair price. He was a very modest man, not the kind of person who thrust himself forward except in battle. So the people began to wonder who had actually killed Gregory, and would receive the prize of beauty. The princess was brought before Abdullah bin Saad, and here she witnessed an argument going on among the warriors present. "What are they arguing about?" she asked an attendant. "About the killing of your father," he replied. "I saw the man who got to my father and killed him," said the girl. This was conveyed to Abdullah bin Saad, who questioned the girl. "Can you identify him?" "If I see him, I will know him," the princess answered. After this, many young warriors were paraded in front of the princess. When Abdullah bin Zubair passed by her, keeping his gaze averted, she said, "This is the one, by the Messiah. He killed my father." Abdullah bin Saad turned to Abdullah bin Zubair and asked why he had concealed the fact of his killing the Roman king. Abdullah bin Zubair simply said, "He for whose sake I killed him would make it known." Abdullah bin Zubair got the girl. He did not marry her, just kept her as a slave, and in due course she became the mother of his children. Whether she was still with him when he declared himself caliph at Mecca in 61 Hijri, 681 AD, is not known. Someone had to go to Medina to deliver the news of the Muslim victory and describe the spoils taken in the campaign. Abdullah bin Saad made a sound choice of messenger, Abdullah bin Zubair. There was no one better qualified to give the faithful an account of how the campaign had been fought, and Abdullah bin Zubair promptly set off on his journey. He travelled very fast, completing in 20 days a journey over which a caravan would normally labor for 3 months. Upon arrival at Medina, he went to the house of Caliph Usman and told him briefly how things had gone. Usman asked him to give a full account of the campaign to all the Muslims in the capital, and ordered an immediate congregation in the mosque. When the Muslims had gathered, Abdullah bin Zubair, with his father present as a member of the audience, narrated the entire story of the campaign from A to Z, including the details of the last glorious day of battle. He spoke with great eloquence and neglected nothing except the part that he himself had played in gaining victory for Islam. As a result of his modesty and reticence to blow his own trumpet, an impression was created in Medina that the chief architect of victory was the commander-in-chief, Abdullah bin Saad. This impression was exploited by the Umayyads, of whom Abdullah bin Saad was one, and they spread the word that their man was a great hero and deserved to be saluted as the conqueror of Africa. While Abdullah bin Zubair was thrilling his audience in Medina with the narrative of the Battle of Subetula, the Muslim army was on its way back from Africa. After a journey of nearly 3 months, the army arrived at Fustat, either in the closing weeks of 27 or the early weeks of 28 Hijri, which began on 25th September 648. Africa had been won by Muslim arms and then abandoned. A great campaign had been fought by the Muslims and the best of North Africa conquered. After a long and arduous march, they had taken on the major power in Africa and roundly defeated it. It was a great feat of Muslim arms, a splendid jewel in the crown of the faithful. We have no knowledge of the casualties suffered in the campaign, especially in the bloody battle of Subetula, but it is obvious that a great deal of blood was shed, mainly Roman and African blood. Ma'bad bin Abbas, cousin of the Prophet ﷺ, fell in battle. Having killed King Gregory and crushed his army in battle, the Muslims had put an end, though not permanently, to the remnants of the Roman Empire in Africa, after 8 glorious centuries of Roman rule. For the first time, they had come in conflict with and beaten a German nation, the Vandals who served in large numbers in Gregory's army. All Africa lay at their feet. A little push would have taken them to Tangier and the Atlantic. A new and vast land would be added to the world of Islam, in which the law of the Quran would run. The majority of the local population would sooner or later embrace the new faith, and the message of Islam would be spread to the western limits of the known world. But this did not happen. Having done so much, having suffered so much, having shed so much blood, and in the end having achieved so much, the victorious Muslim army of Abdullah bin Saad abandoned its conquests and marched back to Egypt. Only the wealth which they brought back and the memories of the campaign bore witness that they had set foot in Africa. The serious reader might question the wisdom of the campaign if it led to nothing better than this. The answer to this question lies in the fact that the strong hand of Umar was no longer there to guide the destinies of the Muslim state. Umar was averse to venturing into Africa and had forbidden Amrbinalaas to do so. But had he been in charge when this campaign was launched, his religious dedication, his political insight, and his driving ambition to strengthen the establishment of the Muslim state would have led to better consequences. And his generals, all close companions of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, would outdo their caliph in religious zeal and selfless service to the cause of Islam. They were not only brave soldiers and exemplary commanders, but altogether perfect specimens of the holy warrior, unlike Abdullah bin Saad bin Abi Sarh, who had been an apostate and who had once been sentenced to death by the Holy Prophet ﷺ. With the departure of Umar, the temptation to acquire wealth raised its ugly head in the Muslim state. No longer was a strict watch kept on the finances of the governors of provinces and the generals of armies. Officers began to take liberties with money, which belonged to the state, and were not taken to task. This became evident in this very campaign, and the handling of the booty taken in the Battle of Subetula led to serious objections. When ordering the invasion of Africa and sending his 10,000 men from Medina to Egypt, Caliph Usman had written to Abdullah bin Saad, "If tomorrow Allah Most Glorious gives you victory in Africa, then yours is a fifth of the state's fifth of the booty given by Allah to the Muslims." Abdullah bin Saad remembered the words of the Caliph. When all the spoils of war were in, he distributed 4/5 among the soldier, as per Quranic law, and of the remaining 1/5, which was the share of the state, he kept 1/5 for himself and sent the balance to Medina. And the person he put in charge of the share of the state was Marwan bin al-Hakam, which was tantamount to asking a thief to look after your cash. His soldiers came to know about this, and shortly after, a delegation from Abdullah bin Saad's army traveled to Medina and saw the Caliph. They complained against what he had done, taking 1/5 of the fifth. Usman said, "I have given it to him, but I leave it to you. If you agree, he shall keep it. If you are angry about it, it shall be taken away." "We are angry," said the delegates. Usman assured them that the money would be recovered from Abdullah. Then they asked the Caliph to dismiss him from the post because they did not want him as their commander after what had happened. To this Usman would not agree. However, he wrote to Abdullah bin Saad, told him how people felt about the matter of the fifth of the fifth, urged him to pay more attention to the goodwill of his fellows, and instructed him to give that fifth away in charity. Then there was the episode of Marwan bin al-Hakam. He too was an evil man and had been forbidden by the Prophet to enter Medina. Caliphs Abu Bakr and Umar had upheld the Prophet's ban against him, but now he was in again, and he had been put in charge of the state's fifth. He promptly took 50,000 dinars from the fifth for himself, and he was allowed to get away with it. In later years he was publicly accused of the embezzlement by Abdullah bin Zubair, but he still got away with it. People began to get rich, and as the years rolled by, they got richer and richer. Even some of the high-ranking companions amassed large fortunes. When Caliph Usman died, he left behind 150,000 gold dinars, 2 million silver dirhams, and landed property worth 100,000 dinars. This was all perfectly legal, of course, because Islam allowed the lawful acquisition of wealth, and there was no upper limit fixed for it. Although the Prophet ﷺ had set an example of frugality and austerity, and the first two caliphs had followed that example, as Ali was later to display it to perfection. The wealth of the senior companions, including Usman's, was lawfully and honestly acquired. They had not sinned or broken the law. But people did remember that shortly before his death by assassination, when Caliph Umar had performed the annual pilgrimage along with his son Abdullah, the two of them had spent 16 dinars on their journey to and from Mecca. Upon their return to Medina, when Umar checked the account, he remarked to his son, "We have been extravagant on our journey." End of chapter 15.